who is Dr. Sarah Puddicombe, and she is the Assistant Director, Applications and Funding at the NIHR Evaluation, Trials, Studies Coordinating Centre. So this is at the National Institute of Health Research, based at Southampton in the UK. She has been at the NIHR since 2011, initially working on the HTA programme, but more recently as Assistant Director, Applications and Funding. As the organisation of the KCE trials period has been inspired by the NIHR HTA programme, who better to speak to you today than somebody with so much experience? So it's with great pleasure, Sarah.
Thank you for having me, and it's been a real pleasure actually working with Frank and the team to talk about how we undertake health technology assessment and manage the programme in the UK and how that can be translated into the Belgian context. So the NIHR is essentially the research arm of the NHS, and it celebrated its 10th year this year. And as your Minister said, everything that we do within the NIHR is focused on meeting the needs of patients and the public, of clinicians and decision makers within the NHS, and to produce really robust evidence to inform health care decision making and improve outcomes for patients, and ultimately to improve the health and wealth of the nation. The HTA is one of the many research programmes that NIHR manage, and we've developed an integrated health research system, which Tom Wally will talk much more about. But I just wanted to reflect that the system is working in a much more unified way now to speed the delivery of clinical studies and to really bring benefits to patients. Largely through some significant infrastructure funding in terms of clinical trials research networks, which provide staff to set up sites, recruit to studies to time and target, as well as clinical trials unit support funding and wider support for applicants in the research community to put in high quality bids to get successful clinical trials and studies, pragmatic studies funded. So this is some of the NIHR programmes that we manage within our centre, and they all have both commissioned and researcher-led arms. Now, the HTA programme, shown in the ring, is the longest-standing programme. It's been around for over 20 years, and it's the largest public funder of clinical trials in the UK, and spends on average about £78 million a year. The programme is particularly significant because it funds pragmatic clinical studies, looking at clinical and cost effectiveness in real-life NHS settings with real-life patients. And it can initially it started to fund just evidence synthesis, and that's evolved into more complex evidence synthesis with health economic analysis, and now into a majority of primary studies that are generating evidence to inform decision makers and to inform patient outcomes and improvement in healthcare. The programme is quite distinct, therefore, then from standard comparative effectiveness, which tends to be using databases of research and comparing one drug against another. And we also have a sort of a more early phase approach in NIHR, where we fund that translational research from basic into evaluation research through the efficacy mechanisms and evaluation programme, jointly funded with the MRC in the UK. And this really focuses on safety and efficacy, clinical efficacy studies with the opportunity to look at the mechanisms of either the intervention or the disease. So again, a sort of a much earlier phase in the process. So this is a summary of the NIHR programme, and the remit of the programme, I'd like to re-emphasise, is producing independent research that really looks at the effectiveness and cost effectiveness and broader impacts of healthcare treatments and tests for anyone within the NHS, and to see this particularly evidence users within the NHS. It has 3 work streams. A commissioned work stream, very much led by the programme to identify specific patient needs. A researcher-led programme where researchers can put in their own suggestions, and another stream to support NICE in their guidance programme. NICE are supported by the programme through independent on-contract teams to produce specific technology assessment reports. And these independent reports are then taken by NICE into their assessment process. So in the UK, there's a difference between health technology assessment and health technology appraisal, which is undertaken by sort of policymakers, and they can make policy then decisions about which interventions should be adopted within the NHS and those which should be disinvested. So there's a slight subtle difference here between HTA in the UK and possibly in Europe. We also have another researcher-led arm, which is government-led, called the Theme Calls, where there's an annual theme across the country to look at specific areas of need, such as obesity or dementia. So this really then illustrates the difference between the funding streams. And I'd like to re-emphasise how the Commission stream is very much focused on addressing market failure. And that market failure, indeed, is whether the commercial market is willing to fund research or, indeed, whether the researcher community are willing to undertake that research. And we have examples of that sort of, those sorts of failures in terms of Lucentis and Avastin in our IVAN trial, where the cheaper drug, Avastin, manufactured by the same company, wasn't going to be investigated. And in undertaking that study, we had the potential to save about £80 million a year for the health service. In terms of researchers, then, there may be difficult or complex studies that they aren't particularly interested in undertaking. And this work stream pushes and promotes them to take that work on. This might be, for instance, antimicrobial coating on catheters. Which one's the best? Not a particularly exciting or sexy topic, but something that makes a real difference to patients. So the stream is designed to really measure and address the needs of decision makers within the NHS, and particularly patients, and improve their health care. The topics are prioritised by expert panels, and those panels comprise patients, commissioners, clinicians, really wide range of stakeholders within the UK, and their briefs are then advertised to the research community. Proposals that come in are then assessed in terms of compliance to that brief and for their scientific quality, the feasibility, the relevance of the research, and the value for money, not only in the terms of the cost of that proposal, but in the value that it would bring to patient outcomes or savings to the health service. The researcher-led workstream, as I said, directed by researchers who propose topics, and they are assessed through those same panels for a parity of scrutiny, and they undergo the same then consideration at the board of the scientific quality and feasibility. So I'm trying to show how the HTA programme really addresses NHS and policy customer needs, and it does this by engaging really widely with stakeholders from individual patients and clinicians through to local hospitals, right the way through to national groups such as the National Institute of Care Excellence, the National Screening Committee, the James Lind Alliance, Cochrane. We take in a wide range of topics, suggestions, and then work very closely with our panels to prioritise those and then commission them to the research community. We undertake to issue a contract, which is a Department of Health contract with the researchers, and then we monitor, very carefully monitor, the recruitment and the delivery to time and target of those projects, so that we can have a full and final report delivered, or we can intervene and help support them get over problems in recruitment or setup. The final report is then encouraged to be published and communicated, and helped to be adopted by the NHS to promote implementation and uptake. Now, about 76% of all HTA studies are underpinned or taken up in parts of NICE clinical guidelines, and I've already shown you how 100% of NICE guidance is supported by the HTA programme. So the types of studies that HTA tend to fund are really multidisciplinary, multi-centre effectiveness and cost-effectiveness studies, are truly pragmatic and generalisable to the population that you would see of patients that you would see in the NHS. And there are a vast array of studies. Any study that's appropriate to answer the question in the most efficient, effective manner would be funded by the programme. And that can be anything from primary studies through to evidence synthesis and modelling. So how do we go about prioritising need? This slide shows that we have to take into account the frequency and the severity to determine the burden of the disease that we're looking at and the impact on health services, and then also take into account the extent of the evidence gap and how long it will take for that research to be delivered to make a change on clinical practice. And that gives our panels a sort of a guide on how important a question is to an important subject. So this is an overview of the commissioned work stream. And as I said, we take in topic suggestions and work internally to devise a sort of a rough research question and PICO format for that. We then work very closely with our panels and undertake expert review and look at the methods to refine and really hone that into a question that will be relevant and tractable and able to be answered by the research community. We then have a prioritisation group which comprises of all the board chairs and the panel chairs that meet and overview all of the panels, because we've got 5 different expert panels. We've got topics that come in from priority customers, which go through our priority research advisory group, and they all come together, and there's a holistic view of how important these topics are, their relevance, and their sort of potential value to the NHS. And those then are put forward as commissioning briefs and expression of interest invited from the research community, which then go on to a commissioned board. This is an example of a brief showing a research question and how we then refine and show the interventions, what outcomes we might want to look at, the settings of care that we're interested in. So this is an overview of the programme, showing the researcher-led work stream and the commissioned work stream, as well as that priority route for policy customers. And you'll see that they both converge and are seen by the same advisory panel, by the same prioritisation group, and then they go through the board processes from expression of interest to full proposals when they're shortlisted and deemed to be of suitable quality. And at the full proposal stage, they undergo rigorous expert peer review. And that helps inform the board's decision making. And once those proposals are deemed to be fundable, we have an overview across the whole portfolio again, across all the boards, and we rank those proposals according to our overall portfolio, thinking about the budget, and then we ask for those recommendations to be approved by the Department of Health. We then can proceed to fund with changes, where we might modify the proposal and work with the applicants to get a really high quality bid proposal for research, which is then contracted, and we monitor that delivery, ultimately expecting full publication of the findings. So in HTA, we are very much focused on maximising the impact of our health research funding, and we use the adding value framework defined by Ian Chalmers and Paul Glasziou to really address these 5 pillars. And I think I've shown you today that we're really focused on making very relevant questions to research users, especially thinking about important patient outcomes, because that's what matters. Having that patient involvement throughout the process really helps us hone and have research that will matter to patients and be more likely to be taken up into practice. Through our commissioning process, we ensure that the research design is appropriate, the conduct and analysis and the methodology underpinning that research proposal is robust. And in all cases, all primary research is funded only by a systematic review of the existing evidence, if that's been put in place. So in terms of the monitoring, we make sure through our monitoring of projects that there is an efficient research delivery, and that we are ensuring timely recruitment to target. And in the full publication, we expect full results, both positive and negative, to be reported, and in such a way that the results could be reproduced if required, and then that the results are put in the context of a systematic review at the end. So by way of an example, this is one of the trials of the year from the Society of Clinical Trials in America, Paramedic. Now, there was a mechanical chest compression device being adopted by the sort of ambulance service in the UK, quite costly, and there was a comparison between this mechanical device and manual chest compressions by well-trained paramedics. The study showed that there was no benefit or no additional benefit of using this mechanical device, and that the NHS could save over £40 million by just having well-trained paramedics delivering CPR. So this is an example of the sorts of things that we can fund and drive savings for the NHS. Frank asked me just to touch on some of the infrastructure, and Tom's going to be talking about the Clinical Trials Research Network a little in his talk, but just to say that there's a tremendous amount of support for applicants within the UK, which is provided by NIHR, both in terms of putting in high-quality bids, thinking about the methodology, in terms of supporting public and patient involvement, both through the RDS and Involve, and through clinical trials units, which can provide expertise to applicants in many aspects of the delivery and coordination of research, as well as the clinical research networks. So, in summary, we fund pragmatic clinical and cost-effectiveness trials. We identify and prioritise important needs and involve patients throughout the entire process, and clinicians and commissioners and decision makers. The boards are really rigorous in sort of looking at scientific rigour, value for money and relevance of the research, and we only fund primary research that has a good evidence base behind it. So by monitoring to time and target, we assure that the money is best spent and there's efficient use of that resource and the best use of public funds. And by publishing and disseminating, we promote uptake by the policymakers and implementation into practice. Thank you.
Clinical research networks are part of your infrastructure. How do you find a network? Is it a regional network or is it a national network?
So we've got a national coordinating centre and sort of 15 local network regions that cover all the sort of specialties within it. So it's now much more cohesive than it used to be. We used to have topic-specific networks in the UK, but now they're actually more local but cover the various different areas within there. So through the coordinating centre, it's much easier for researchers to say, I want to work in this area and I need to define sites and I need staff to help me recruit to them.
How do you select the centres to be part of this network?
So, we already have, through the Clinical Research Network, we already have the network in place with hubs. So you wouldn't select it, you would go to the various regions to recruit for you.
What's the time frame from application to approval?
Interesting. Well, so in NIHR, we are really focused on push the pace. Currently, between application and approval, we're about, in the HTA programme, 7.5 months. But we're looking to try and reduce that down wherever possible. And for evidence synthesis, that's anything between 3 and 4 months.
Roger Bouillon. Many of the research questions you address are in need of an international approach. So we will not disagree with that. What is the percentage of your present program that in fact is internationally oriented or has participating centers outside the UK?
I can't give you a figure off the top of my head, but we do have, we fund the UK arm of international studies, and we also fund studies which have UK recruitment or collaborations abroad. So, for instance, right now we have a collaboration with Australia, whereby we agreed priorities, and we advertise those jointly, requesting collaborative bids from both countries to address an area of priority. Something like smoking cessation has been one that we've done recently, and we've had some success in that approach, of a much more coordinated approach, and actually we're sort of evaluating opportunities for more of those types of approaches in future.
So evidence that generate a large number of very interesting results and studies, etc. How do you communicate these results to clinicians or pharmacists who are going to implement
So we have for every research application, there's an expectation that they will have a dissemination plan that will be informed by public and patient involvement. So where applicants have done a really good job of engaging the public, actually they've got really good dissemination networks put in place and opportunities for social networking. There's the publication in the journal, but actually we hold back the publication, our full publication in the journal, with the expectation that peer-reviewed reports will be taken up and disseminated. So, for instance, Lancet articles, New England Journal articles. We have a growing sort of number of our trials that are actually sort of having high-impact journals. And then through NIHR, we've got a dissemination centre, which then synthesises and pulls together signals to try and get those very important research findings out in a very usable format to the evidence users, so that we can promote further uptake into practice.